Welcome to Sarder TV. I'm Vaishali Jain. We're excited to have Sami Saydjari join us today. Sami is a leading expert in the field of cybersecurity, and he's here to tell us more about his book, Engineering Trustworthy Systems. Sami, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you here.
You're welcome. My pleasure. So
tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the field of cybersecurity.
I would say I'm very interested in research problems and hard problems. And so when I got into the field, I wanted to pick one of the most difficult problems that I could pick, and cybersecurity was the one I picked. And I love to explore new things, and so that's why I picked cybersecurity.
Tell us what inspired you to write this book.
There's a couple of things. One is I have a number of mentors who are getting older, and there's an expression that says that when an elder passes away, it's like burning down a library. And so I wanted to preserve some of the knowledge they passed on to me and some of the knowledge that I've developed on my own to the next generation.
So who would benefit from reading this book? Who's your target audience?
I think there are many different ones. The primary target audience is cybersecurity professionals. People who are either beginning or even people who've been in the field a long time. It's new knowledge for some people in breadth and in depth of the knowledge. But also for people who design systems who aren't security experts. So systems engineers, software engineers, as well as people who manage those kinds of people, so they have a general familiarity with cybersecurity.
The title of your book is Engineering Trustworthy Systems. Define trust and system for us as it relates to your book.
So it's really about trustworthiness. And so when you trust somebody, you trust them to do something. And so we need to trust our systems, that they need to be worthy of our trust to do the things that we expect them to do. And so it involves security, but also assurance that they don't fail. And so trustworthiness is sort of a broader term than security, to make sure that we can rely on systems to do what we want them to do. And systems can be narrowly defined as a computer or a network or a chip or a society. It can be as big or as small as you want. It doesn't have to just be the technology. It can involve human processes as well.
So why is trust such an important component of devising a cybersecurity system?
Trust is, it's important in and of itself, so that when you take your money to the bank, for example, you want to trust that you can get it back out again. So it's intrinsically important that we be able to trust systems, that they do what we expect them to do and they don't do anything that we don't expect them to do. And that involves security. We don't want systems to take our information, to steal it, or to corrupt the information. So it's very important that we be able to trust the systems, but it's also important that other systems be able to trust them, because if we have, we can't trust one system, but another system that depends on that system, then the trust kind of devolves around all the systems that connect to each other.
Tell us about some system attacks that have been historically significant.
In the early days, the military was the most interested in this problem, and they were interested in losing classified information, secrecy. And so they were very concerned that people would steal on military systems that were being used for both classified and unclassified processing. So that's historically where cybersecurity really found its roots, is in military security. But eventually, people began to use systems for normal kinds of things like banking and everyday email. So then we had kind of people attacking systems not to get military secrets, but to start extorting things. And we had the advent of worms, like the Morris worm in the early days, viruses. So that the worms and virus era was a very big change. And then finally we have these things called zero-day attacks, which are just very, very complex attacks and very, very deep parts of the operating system and applications that are very sophisticated. So attacks are getting much more sophisticated nowadays.
So then how do you know if your system is under attack?
It's very hard, actually. The ability to distinguish between an attack and a failure is very difficult. But one has to become a student of how attacks work and how they might manifest to be able to distinguish whether a system is merely failing, which systems fail a lot, or whether you're under attack. And so you look at things like well, for example, if you get a ransomware note saying your system's under attack, then you know your system's under attack. But figuring out whether you've lost information through some sort of cyber attack, that's much more complicated. Requires you to review the logs of your data to see what kind of transactions happen, anything unusual. So we typically do one of two things. We look for a pattern that we're aware of how attack might look but through the logs of the system, or we look for an anomaly, right? This is a change from what we normally see. So we kind of record what the system's behavior normally looks like, and then we compare the current behavior with that norm. And if it's out of the norm, we then go in and look more carefully to see whether it's an attack or whether it's just an unusual situation.
What are some steps in understanding what the process and the nature of a cyber attack is? And how do cyber engineers go about understanding that and detecting that?
So one of my mentors, one of the pieces of books in the burning down of libraries that we worry about, one of my mentors said, theories of security come from theories of insecurity. And by that, we mean that you have to study attacks and how they work in order to understand how to defend against them. So security engineers or even general engineers need to study attacks carefully, and they need to understand the mechanisms by which they succeed in general so that they can then figure out the processes by which to defend them. Instead of plugging your finger in the dike for every hole that happens to be there, you study more generally how the holes form in the dike so that you can make the dike stronger.
What's the relationship between cybersecurity and risk?
So I see risk as the primary metric for cybersecurity. So risk and cybersecurity go hand in hand in the same way that all other kind of risks go hand in hand. So when you look at the risk of, let's say, a building burning down, you develop building code so that the building doesn't burn down as likely. And then, for the residual risk, you take out insurance. And then you decide how much to invest in making the building able to withstand a fire. Cybersecurity is no different. One has to understand what's at risk, right? So how bad can bad get when a cyber attack happens? Are you going to lose $1.50 or are you going to lose your entire business or your entire mission? And if it's the entire mission, you should invest more. If it's $1.50, you should invest less. So people first have to understand what's at stake and the degree to which they depend on cybersecurity. And then they have to understand how likely a cybersecurity is to happen, in the same way that you have to understand how likely a fire is to happen, given all the measures you've taken against a fire. So you have to take that together, and risk is about the probability that something will happen times how bad when it happens, how bad the damage will be. So once you understand that, you can understand how to engineer cybersecurity to some standard that you would like to set for yourself.
Tell us where risk comes from and how do you go about mitigating it?
Yeah, so risk comes from a large variety of different places and different parts of a system. And so sometimes people talk about systems being at different levels, so applications, like software applications, like email. So risk comes from poorly designed email with holes, software security holes in it that people can then exploit. Or in the operating system on which that application runs, or on the hardware on which that operating system runs. So you sort of can attack a system at multiple levels. So these risks, these vulnerabilities, better to say, come from design errors or implementation errors that attackers can then exploit.
Tell us how creating a secure environment can actually impact employee morale.
That's a great question. So one of the things people have to understand is that security can be a good thing and a bad thing, and sometimes security is a pain. And even as a security expert, I don't like it when somebody asks me for a 50-character password with exclamation points, 3 periods, and not more than 2 A's in a row, and then ask me to change it every other day. Security can be a pain, and so. And people can find it so burdensome that they choose to go work somewhere else, or they choose not to be as productive because it's a burden, it's a bureaucracy. And so the more transparent, the more easy we can make security so that it just happens underneath. It's just your email is secure by default, your operating system is secure by default, and you, the user, or even you, the software developer, doesn't have to think too much about security. Otherwise, it's a burden. And when things are burdens, people tend not to do them.
So then what are some things leaders can do to make sure they're not creating this environment of distrust, but they're also securing their systems against these attacks?
I think they have to look at the trade-off between more security or more burdensome security and the morale issue, right? And so if they can spend a little bit more money to, let's just say, have the developers integrate security in a more transparent way. So if they spend just a little bit more money doing that, the money they recover in the morale improvements are so much bigger over the lifetime of a system. So the general rule in engineering is invest up front, and because the tail is where you really end up spending the money. So if you get this design right at the very beginning of their project, whether it's the human user interface to make users happy, or whether it's just making sure there aren't a lot of vulnerabilities by making sure there's not a lot of bugs in the system, the upfront investment almost always pays off on the order of 10 to 1 in terms of dollars invested.
So you talk about confidentiality as it relates to secrecy. Tell us more about this concept.
Yeah, so confidentiality is one of 3 aspects of security. Integrity and availability being the other 2. So confidentiality is about secrecy. And secrecy is important, but it's not the most important thing. And secrecy, trade secrets, for example, if Coke loses their trade secret formula for Coke, that might be of concern to them. But if you look at institutions with secrets, they sometimes depend too heavily on those secrets. And the moment you mark something as a secret, it becomes vulnerable to being stolen, because you're almost like you're painting a bullseye on that piece of data to say, this is the really valuable stuff. I think it was Benjamin Franklin said that 3 may keep a secret if 2 are dead. And so the moment you have a secret, it just endangers the mission if your mission depends on that secrecy. So what I advocate is that people minimize their secrets. And certainly we need a few secrets in our lives, even personally, right? But as an institution, you may need a few secrets, but minimize those secrets and then protect them very, very heavily for those small number of things that are truly secret, and let the other ones go, and don't depend so heavily on those being secrets.
Tell us what you mean by mission elements as it relates to cybersecurity.
So mission and mission elements refers to what the system was primarily designed for, the reason for being. And one of the important lessons for my colleagues in cybersecurity is they often forget that cybersecurity is not the point of the system. And so they want to think that they're the center of the world, as we all would like to think. But really, cybersecurity is there to support the mission, whatever the mission of the system is. Is it a banking system? Then the mission is to keep people's money and invest it. If it's a nonprofit to distribute food, then the mission is to distribute food. Whatever the mission of the system is the primary purpose, and cybersecurity there is to support the mission. And so I say things like, it's the mission, stupid, right? I mean, it's sort of like, to help people understand, to not forget that we're optimizing the mission, not optimizing security. So people sometimes say that the most secure system is the one that you turn off, right? And it's sort of half funny but half tragic, right? Because the point of the system is not to be off, right? The point of the system is to do its function. And so if we keep in mind that if you put so much security on a system and you make it so cumbersome to use that the customers, let's say a bank's customers, don't want to use it anymore and they go to the competitor, you've lost your mission. You've lost sight of why you were using security, because it's about the mission of the institution, not about the security.
So how does creating a focus on these mission elements actually create a focus on strategic harm? And why is that important?
Well, this is where we bring in the C-suite, the CEOs, the CIOs, and we ask them what keeps them up at night in terms of a cyber attack. What could seriously damage their mission? And so they begin to participate in the risk assessment in ways that they've never participated before. And so when you ask them this question, you typically get about a half a dozen things like, If let's say my bank were hacked and everybody learned it the next day and I lost, just a few million right out of all of my assets, but then all of my customers go away because they can't trust my bank anymore. That's we call a resume updating event for the CEO, right? So we ask them for their resume updating events, right? And they give us these events, and then that becomes the strategic focus of the system, as opposed to thinking about all of the bottom-up attacks. If you think about every attack that you can think about, and some of them cost you $1.50, or some attacks are highly unlikely. But if you think about strategically what could really, really damage the institution, then that's the one where you have to focus your energy.
So you talk about modeling in your book. Tell us how modeling helps in understanding complex systems.
It's very much like abstraction in language. When we want to talk about tables, we don't enumerate all possible tables. We have an abstraction called a table so that we can conveniently talk about tables without specifically talking about that table or that table over there. And so the same thing is true in models. It allows us to focus on the essence, right? A table has two or three or four legs, but it's got a flat surface you can put stuff on. And that's the part we're interested in saying table. The same thing is true in a system. We want to model the things that are important, not the details of what every memory register has in it, but rather how information flows in the system, how it connects to external systems. So we look at the pieces that are interesting by abstracting out the pieces that aren't interesting from a security perspective, that allows us to make it understandable to human beings. Because if we had to look at every detail of a system, we would not be able to comprehend it anymore.
You also talk about adversaries in your book. Tell us about the different types of adversaries that you outline and the attributes that they have.
Yes, so there are many different kinds and they behave differently, and that's why the defender needs to understand what's their motivation, what's their resources, how much risk are they willing to take, and these are the kinds of things we are concerned with. Because if your adversary is only able to, let's say it's a hacker, right? A 14-year-old hacker sitting at home, they don't have access to $100 million to buy an insider. They don't have the patience really to wait 10, 15 years to get into your system. So their kind of methodology is different than a nation state, for example, who is at peace but maybe wants to steal secrets, right? And they're very patient, and they may have $500 million to spend. And when you have that patience and that amount of time, the kinds of attacks, high stealth, operating system level attacks, very difficult to detect, are much different than a hacker who tends to come in loudly and they'll try to exploit attacks that have already been described before, and just kind of what I call doorknob turn. The doorknob turn. They go to every house and they turn the doorknob until one opens, and then they kind of go in. That's one class of attacker that can be solved by patching your system, right? Locking your door. A nation state's a much harder one and requires a little bit more subtlety and sophistication in the defense.
Tell us how cyber attacks have evolved over the years.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the early years, they were simpler attacks. They usually were exploiting a single bug. We didn't have a lot of great defense systems around, so they didn't really have to worry about bypassing defenses. And they were kind of one-off attacks. So there was just one example of that attack, somebody did it, and then people figured it out, and that one system, they fixed it, and that was the end of that. Now, in today's society, we have millions of computers that look identical. They're the same computer, Windows or Macs or whatever. And so when you penetrate a system like that, there are millions of opportunities around. And even when the patch comes out, not everybody puts the patch in at the same time. And so millions remain vulnerable for a long time. And so what happens today is we have very, very clever attackers who exploit a vulnerability, find a vulnerability called the zero-day attack, right, for the first day they find it. And then they encode their attack up, and then they upload that script to a hacker board. And then a bunch of hackers download it, and then they can use it without really understanding what they're doing. It's almost like a weapon that they can just pick up and point at targets that are soft targets because they haven't patched their system yet. And this vulnerability can continue for a very, very long time because the tail time for people to actually close all the vulnerabilities can be years.
How do leaders assess how much they should be investing in cybersecurity?
Their answer to that question is whatever's left over from everything else. Or, if an attack happened last week, we'll make the investment slightly more this week. Really, it's the same kind of thing that we have to do in all other kinds of risks to business. We have to calculate what the potential damage is and then decide our investment based on that. Today, the average business invests about 3% of their IT budget. Risk analyses strategically show that it should be really closer to about 9%. So just on the surface, they're underinvesting by a factor of 3. But CEOs, CIOs should be asking themselves, what is the right level? Is this budget the right level? Well, how do you know? Well, the way you know is to understand the risks, to do risk assessment, to understand what is at stake. And when they know what's at stake, then the investment will be clearer that why they're underinvesting by a factor of 3.
What are some of the non-monetary costs of not implementing a robust cybersecurity system?
Well, there's faith in the organization by various people. And these faiths can turn into monetary losses as well, indirectly. But if you're in the business of protecting information, service business, like many people are, take Facebook or Google, and or Yahoo, I guess, a recent example, and you demonstrate that your users should not have faith in you because you are not taking due care of that information, that loss of faith is a loss of reputation in your company. And loss of reputations ultimately translate into loss of money, loss of revenue. The other kind of faith is the faith of your investors, because they're expecting a return on their investment, and they know that if you don't do a good job, customers will eventually go to your competitors. And so we've seen significant drops in stock value, sometimes $100 million overnight because of a loss in faith in investors. So reputation, faith, trust is really what it's about, and the loss of trust from not doing a good job can be devastating. It could actually terminate the existence of an organization, and has.
So when we think about cybersecurity, we tend to think about software. In your book, you talk about how hardware is also important to consider. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit more about this.
It's like, let's take home architecture, right? And so you build a very strong building, but if you build it on sand, the building's going to fall over, right? And it can be a beautifully well-structured building. It's the same idea. Software operates on top of hardware. People lose sight of this, right? Because nobody sees the hardware anymore, particularly with the clouds, right? We all do cloud computing, and we have our laptop, but most of the hardware is elsewhere in some machine room that we never see. And so we lose sight of the fact that if the hardware is subverted, if the hardware is not secure, then nothing you do in the software matters, because the hardware can simply override it. In the same way that the sand underneath of a house being shaky, I mean, somebody can just dig underneath the house and disrupt the foundation. The same thing is true in cybersecurity. So we have to pay careful attention to trustworthy hardware, and we've lost sight of that, I think, because there's so much emphasis on all the problems that have happened with software, but we have to also keep in mind that software operates on hardware, and that needs to be trustworthy.
Tell us about cryptography and how that works.
So cryptography is a very specialized sub-area of cybersecurity, and it involves not reading other people's mail, right? I mean, so when you send mail to somebody, you'd like to make sure that nobody can see it, right? And whether it's mail or any other kind of communication, it's about securing the communication. And so we use mathematics to transform that communication in a way that only the sender and the intended recipients can see it. And that mathematical transformation is not reversible by somebody intercepting that stream after it's been transformed by encrypting it. And so they can't look at that and do something to figure out what it said unless they have a key. Right? And so we have developed these techniques so that we can secure the communication between users. We've also developed another kind of cryptography where I can, because of the way we distribute keys, I can be sure you are who you say you are. So this is called public key cryptography. And so it's used to authenticate, which is also an important use of cryptography today, so that we know that when somebody says, I'm Joe and I want $100 out of my bank account, that's really Joe and not somebody pretending to be Joe. And so cryptography is a very useful tool to secure our communications and prove who we are.
What's the importance of prevention and detection in a set of cybersecurity attacks?
Great question. So there's a combination of techniques that we have to keep in mind. So ideally, in a perfect world, we would prevent all attacks. No attacks would be possible. And in some cases, we have to be concerned with the possibility that a preventative technique is there, but maybe fails, because cybersecurity, like any other system, fails in some ways. And so we have to backstop that potential failure. There's also certain kinds of attacks that a preventative system can't do. For example, life cycle attacks, right? Or where somebody has put Trojan horses or malicious code inside the software that got originally put inside the system. Trying to prevent an attacker from coming in doesn't stop somebody who is already on the inside with malicious code in the software inside of your system. And so you need to have detection techniques. And so it's what we call layering. So you want to have a combination of preventative techniques for certain classes of attacks and then detection in case that attacker gets in or is already in, to detect the attack once it's ongoing. And then you want to be able to then, once you've detected it, to stop it, right, which is reacting to the attack and stopping that attack before it does significant damage.
Tell us about risk assessment and determining how much risk a system is taking on.
Right, so risk assessment is sort of a formal process that you go through to come to understand what risks you're taking. And I think most people today kind of guess, oh, I don't think we're taking that much risk. And when people guess, they're almost always wrong. And we've actually done this experiment where we said, okay, guess how much risk the system is taking. We'd ask a manager, and then we do a risk assessment. And it's always like 3 times the amount of risk that they thought they were taking. Because when you really look at it in detail, you realize that the ways of bringing down a system are much more varied than people understand. And so we get managers to start out with what is it they're worried about, and then the engineers come in and say all the possible ways that that can happen. And we love to bring in like very out-of-the-box thinkers for that, because these are people that kind of come at the problem sideways in ways that people didn't think about before, and they tend to be very smart attacks that aren't that expensive that can have really serious damage. And so when you take all of those smart people together thinking about this, they develop a risk assessment that says, here's the likelihood that these things can happen. And if they happen, here's how damaging this will be to your operation. And then we bring people like red teams in who actually do the attacks, right? Not to actually do the damage, but to show that they can happen. And then the managers can be convinced that not only is it theoretically this bad, here's exactly how it happens and how it can happen to you.
What is the primary cybersecurity metric and why?
Yeah, so I'd say risk is the primary metric. And it's a metric in many, many different senses of the word metric. We look at it as, for example, for deciding how much to invest, right? You can monetize it and say, you have $1 million worth of risk, right? Looking at the damages times the probability. And so then you can decide how much to invest. So it's it's a monetary metric, but it's also a goodness metric from an engineering perspective. Because if you don't understand, let's say I have 2 alternate designs for securing a system. If you don't understand how to measure whether system A approach is better than system B approach, if you don't have a metric for that, you have no way of engineering towards something better than you're at. And so risk has got to be the metric of saying this one has more risk than the other one, and so maybe you don't want to do that. Or maybe it has a little bit more risk, but it costs half the amount and it's only 5% more risky. Well, then maybe I do want to do that. So in order to quantify goodness is an engineering metric, risk is the goodness metric, to allow us to compare different systems and decide whether you've reached a good enough goodness criteria that you decide to set.
Tell us a little bit more about cyber war and its ramifications.
That's a scary topic. So cyber war, it has different kinds of flavors to it, but the thing is that today's society depends really heavily on computers, much more heavily than people imagine, in different ways. So for example, the power grid depends on computers. People don't understand this, right? If computers were attacked properly, we could lose about 70% of the power grid for 6 months across the United States. That's bad, right? And that's so bad that the United States could lose sovereignty over something like that. And so cyber wars can attack real systems having real effects on things like telecommunications, power grids, banks, oil and gas, the foremost critical of what we call the critical infrastructures. And so the civilian infrastructure becomes the target. The military is not the target. And oftentimes, when you talk to a nation like the United States about cybersecurity, they talk about securing the military or the military cybersecurity. How are they going to, the Defense Department, to do a lot of cybersecurity, all of which are important. But the targets of a cyber war are not the military. Well, there's certainly one target, but the primary target, if you sort of use the analogy of the brain, of the body, is the military, sort of the immunity system. And yes, we do have diseases that target the immunity system like HIV, but the real vital organs of the system are the brain and the heart, right, and the muscles. And so the power grid, the banking system, telecommunications are the vital organs, and these are the ones that are highly vulnerable today, and cyber war can target those. Furthermore, they can be strategically harmful, and countries have said, if you come at us with a cyber attack, we may respond with a nuclear attack. France has said that, for example, in the past, right, to say that's our deterrence. So you can now see cyber wars beginning to escalate into nuclear war. And I think we're in a very precarious situation now where people are experimenting with cyber attacks. We've seen Russia experiment with cyber attacks. We've seen China do it. And we can get to a point now where there's a misunderstanding or a cyber attack gets out of hand and it could escalate to a kinetic war up to a nuclear war. So I think we have to start to worry about and look at stabilizing the situation with world treaties.
Tell us about your thoughts on the future of cybersecurity then.
Yeah, so I think the trends of attacks becoming more sophisticated is going to continue. You're going to have attacks become more adaptive. And they're going to have to become adaptive on the fly because defenses are getting better. And so it's kind of like an arms race in the same way we have an arms race in the kinetic world, right? So the defenses get better, the attacks get better. The defenses get even better, the attacks get even better. The problem with that is that eventually the attacks are going to begin on the fly analyzing the defenses and figuring out how to get around those defenses. And they're already doing that today in some way by using stealth techniques to sort of fly under the radar of the detection techniques. But they're going to get more sophisticated. And so artificial intelligence techniques will begin to be used. And so the defensive systems will begin to use AI. The offensive systems, the attacks will begin to use AI, and they'll begin to adapt and evolve themselves over time. And they'll begin to have to fight in real time without a lot of human direction because the speed of the attacks will be so fast. And those kind of attacks can get out of hand. And so artificial intelligence mixed with cybersecurity, I think, is a formula for both goodness and a great deal of danger. And we should start thinking about some rules about how that works.
What career advice do you give to people who want to get into the field of cybersecurity?
Three things. I think the first thing is they have to be lifelong students. They have to understand that cybersecurity is a quickly evolving field, and they have to learn from mistakes that other people have made, and they have to learn new ideas every day. So if they're not lifelong learners, probably not a field for you because it's so dynamically changing. So you got to be a learner. I also recommend that they get mentors. People in the field can kind of understand, who've been in the field a long time, understand sort of the chaff from the gems in the field. What's the wheat, what's the chaff? And so at least one good mentor, if not 2 or 3 mentors, to help guide them in the field. The third thing I tell them is to focus on principles. Because the field changes so often and there's a new attack every day, and trying to understand a million different things is overwhelming. But if you focus on the principles, which is what my book is about, is to sort of focus on the principles of cybersecurity and not on the minutiae details of it, but sort of stay at the principles level. The principle level will allow you to adapt quickly. It'll allow you to understand that, oh, this is just another instance of that principle that I already know. And so if you stay at the principal level and continue to develop new principles over time and learn from what's going on and develop these principles, you'll be more insulated against sort of the variations and the very quick evolution that's going on within cybersecurity.
Well, that's great advice, and this was really interesting. So thank you so much for joining us today, Sami.
You're most welcome. It's my pleasure.
And we'll see you next time on Sarder TV.